Mid-game. Fifth inning. And Major League Baseball just did something it almost never does. It pulled the entire umpire crew off the field. Not after the game. Not the next morning in a quietly worded press release. Not in a scheduled review meeting buried in the league office calendar. Right there. Mid-inning. With players still in the dugout, fans still in their seats, and the game technically still in progress, MLB made a decision so urgent, so serious, that it could not wait until the final out. The entire crew was dismissed. Escorted away. Replaced. And the reason? Alleged misconduct. Against Shohei Ohtani. The stadium didn't know how to react. Players on both benches exchanged glances. Coaches stood at the top of dugout steps with expressions that fell somewhere between confusion and disbelief. Broadcasters scrambled for words, because there is no standard script for what they were watching, because this almost never happens. But that wasn't even the most shocking part of the night. Because hours later, when the investigation results were delivered, officially, formally, in the language of league protocol, Ohtani received them. Read them. And then, in a moment that cameras caught from 3 different angles, took his bat and smashed it. Not in anger at an opponent. Not in frustration at a strikeout. In response to a document. In response to words on a page that told him something so significant, so vindicating, so enraging all at once, that even his legendary composure finally shattered. And then came the confession. From one of the umpires himself. What followed would send shockwaves through the sport, and force 2 Diamondbacks players to face consequences that nobody in baseball saw coming. Before anything else, it is important to understand exactly how extraordinary this moment was, because without that context, the rest of the story loses its full weight. Umpires in Major League Baseball are not removed lightly. They are not benched like struggling hitters. They are not pulled from a rotation because one manager complained after a tough loss. The process of formally removing an officiating crew carries institutional weight that most fans never fully appreciate, because it almost never happens in real time, in the middle of a game, with the world watching. The last time something approaching this level of mid-game officiating intervention occurred, it made front-page sports news for weeks. League offices investigated. Policies were reviewed. The story didn't just live in sports sections, it crossed over into broader conversations about accountability, power, and the question of who watches the people whose job it is to watch everyone else. So when MLB made the call to dismiss this specific crew in the 5th inning, not after filing a report, not after a 48-hour review window, but immediately, it signaled one thing above everything else. Whatever they found was not ambiguous. In the world of officiating, ambiguity is the standard defense. A missed call. A different angle. A judgment that reasonable people could disagree on. These are the explanations that protect crews from serious consequences in the vast majority of disputed situations. But dismissal without waiting for the game to end means the evidence was clear enough that leaving that crew on the field for another 4 innings was considered unacceptable. Potentially harmful. Potentially compromising to the integrity of the contest itself. That is not a minor finding. That is a finding that someone in the league office looked at, understood immediately, and decided required action before another pitch was thrown. The question the entire sport was now asking, what did they find? Here is what most of the immediate coverage missed, because it required understanding a process that operates almost entirely out of public view. MLB's umpire oversight system does not begin when a complaint is filed. It runs continuously. Every game, every inning, every call is tracked, logged, and fed into a review structure that most fans don't know exists and most players only learn about when something goes wrong. Pitch tracking technology. Camera networks positioned at angles the broadcast feed never shows. Audio monitoring systems that capture conversations on the field that were never meant to be heard beyond the diamond. All of it is archived. All of it is reviewable. And when a formal complaint triggers an active investigation, all of it becomes evidence. What the investigation into this specific crew revealed, according to sources close to the process, was a pattern. Not a single incident. Not one questionable call that could be explained away by bad positioning or a split-second judgment error. A pattern. Calls that, when mapped against the tracking data, showed a statistical deviation so significant it moved beyond the range of normal human error. Communication between crew members during the game that, when reviewed against the audio record, raised questions about coordination, not around officiating the game correctly, but around something else entirely. And most damning of all, a direct interaction with personnel connected to the opposing team that occurred before the game began. An interaction that, under MLB's conflict of interest guidelines, should have been disclosed and was not. This is where the story stops being about bad umpiring and starts being about something the sport takes far more seriously. Integrity. The investigation results were delivered formally. That is the protocol, a written summary, transmitted through official channels to the players' representatives, outlining the findings and the league's intended course of action. Ohtani received them after the game. In the clubhouse. Away from cameras, away from reporters, in the relative privacy of a space that is usually reserved for the quiet work of recovery and preparation. But the cameras outside caught what happened next. He emerged. Bat in hand, not in the grip of a player heading to the on-deck circle, but loose, almost absent-minded, the way you carry something when your mind is somewhere else entirely. He read. Or perhaps he had already read and was still processing. And then, in a single motion that was over before anyone fully registered it had begun, he brought the bat down. Not against a wall. Not against equipment. Against the ground. The same ground he had punched weeks earlier. The same ground that had absorbed his frustration once before. But this time it was different. Because the first time, he was angry at an accusation. This time, based on everything that followed, he was angry at a confirmation. A confirmation that what he had suspected, what his representatives had quietly communicated concern about, what the people closest to him had sensed in the pattern of calls across multiple games, was real. He had not been imagining it. He had not been oversensitive. He had not been a star player using his platform to deflect legitimate scrutiny. He had been right. And for a man who has built his entire identity around doing things correctly, around earning everything through work, through preparation, through the kind of relentless personal accountability that his former training partner once described in detail to a national audience, being right about something like this carries a specific, complicated weight. It is not triumphant. It does not feel like winning. It feels like grief. Like the discovery that a system you respected did not respect you back. Then came the moment that nobody anticipated. One of the dismissed umpires spoke. Not through a representative. Not in a carefully drafted statement reviewed by lawyers and union officials and media consultants. Directly. In a conversation that was subsequently reported by multiple outlets simultaneously, which is how you know it was not a leak designed to control a narrative, but a genuine, unmanaged moment of a person deciding they needed to say something true. The confession was not a full admission of deliberate targeting. It was something more nuanced, and in some ways, more disturbing. The umpire acknowledged that there had been conversations within the crew about Ohtani specifically. Not about how to call his at-bats fairly. Not about reviewing his tendencies as a hitter to ensure consistent officiating. But about the pressure, external pressure, the origin of which the umpire described only vaguely, to apply a heightened level of scrutiny to his equipment, his behavior, and his interactions with the officiating crew. In plain language, someone, somewhere, had been pushing for Ohtani to be watched differently than other players. And at least one member of that umpiring crew had gone along with it. Not enthusiastically. Not with full understanding of where the pressure was coming from. But gone along with it nonetheless, which, under the guidelines that govern officiating conduct, is itself a serious violation regardless of intent. The confession did two things simultaneously. It validated everything Ohtani's camp had been saying since the original incident. And it opened a door into a much larger question: if an umpiring crew was receiving external pressure to scrutinize a specific player, who was generating that pressure, and why? The answer to that second question pointed directly toward two Diamondbacks players. MLB's response, once the confession was on record and the investigation findings were formally concluded, was swift and, by the standards of a league that typically moves with institutional caution, unusually severe. Two Diamondbacks players received formal disciplinary action. Suspensions. Financial penalties. And perhaps most significantly, a notation in their official league record that will follow every future transaction, every contract negotiation, every arbitration proceeding for the remainder of their professional careers. In baseball, that last consequence is often the most lasting. Suspensions end. Fines get paid. But a formal record of conduct that undermined the integrity of officiating, that is something front offices read carefully when deciding who they want in their clubhouse. The penalties confirmed what the investigation had outlined, that these two players had been involved in the external pressure campaign that the umpire described. The specific mechanism, exactly how the pressure was communicated, through which channels, over what period of time, remains partially redacted in the public summary MLB released. But the conclusion is not redacted. These players took deliberate action to influence how a specific opponent was officiated. And that action produced real consequences in real games. For people inside the sport who have spent careers studying what separates elite performers from everyone else, this revelation carries a message that goes beyond scandal. It is a testament, in the darkest possible way, to just how seriously Ohtani is taken by the people competing against him. You do not build a pressure campaign against a player you are not afraid of. You do not take that kind of institutional risk, the risk of investigation, of exposure, of the exact penalties that just landed, unless you have concluded that beating him through legitimate competition is not something you can reliably do. The misconduct was wrong. The penalties were deserved. But underneath all of it is a truth that no suspension can erase. They were afraid of him. An umpire crew dismissed mid-game. A bat smashed against the ground. A confession delivered outside the normal channels of institutional communication. Two players facing consequences that will follow them for the rest of their careers. On the surface, this is a story about misconduct. About a system that failed and then, to its credit, corrected itself, imperfectly, belatedly, but ultimately in the direction of accountability. But underneath the surface, it is a story about something the sport has always struggled to fully articulate. What happens when someone is so genuinely, undeniably, historically good, that the institutions around them don't know how to process it? There is a version of extraordinary performance that the system is built to handle. The great player who hits well, competes hard, and operates within the understood boundaries of what greatness looks like in this sport. That player gets celebrated. Gets contracts. Gets a plaque in Cooperstown eventually. And then there is another kind. The kind whose performance exists so far outside what the system was designed to evaluate that the system itself begins to malfunction. Begins to reach for explanations. Begins, in its worst moments, to reach for interference. The former training partner who knew this player longest once said something that matters here. He said the numbers don't explain him. The results don't explain him. What explains him is the life built behind the results, the discipline, the preparation, the refusal to separate who you are from what you do. That is exactly the kind of player systems have always struggled with. Not because of anything he did wrong. But because his existence asks a question that makes people uncomfortable. What if someone is just genuinely this good? The umpires have been dismissed. The penalties have been handed down. The investigation is formally closed. But the question lingers. And Ohtani, back in the facility before sunrise, back in the routine that no suspension and no conspiracy and no pressure campaign has ever once disrupted, is already answering it. The same way he always has. In silence. In preparation. In the quiet, daily, unfilmable work of being exactly who he is.